Hi guys, this slideshow is going to introduce you all to ancient Egypt, focusing specifically on its unique geography and on a brief historical overview. The most important aspect of Egyptian geography is the Nile River. In fact, the Nile was so important to Egyptian civilization that Egypt is often called the gift of the Nile. The main reason for this is that it does not really ever rain in Egypt. So that means that all of the water, and therefore all of the agriculture that could happen in Egypt, happened because of the Nile River. The Nile had some other pretty interesting benefits, though. First of all, the Nile flooded regularly. And so this is similar to the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, which we've already talked about. But unlike the Tigris and the Euphrates, which flooded randomly, the Nile flooded the same time every year. And so this provided the normal benefit of flooding rivers, and that is free fertilizer. But it also was much less destructive because the flood could be predicted and its damage could be reduced. Another thing that made the Nile really useful is that it provided easy transportation for a 600-mile stretch from the Mediterranean Sea up to the first really serious rapid called a cataract, which was 600 miles inland. So it was easy to unite this whole region. And you could also engage in long-distance trade, carrying things up and down the Nile. One other thing is that the Nile River had a large delta, which you can see up there. It's that green triangle-shaped thing right there, which is why it's called a delta. But the delta was extremely fertile, kind of marshy lowland, and so it was really productive for agriculture, but it also had very few harbors, which led to Egyptian isolation, which I'll talk about in the next slide. So, like I said, the Egyptian delta, while it was very fertile and good for agriculture, lacked very good harbors. And so this prevented Egypt from developing good sailing technology and establishing sea contact with other civilizations around the Mediterranean. Also, if you look at this map here, you'll notice that the Nile is surrounded by desert on all sides. This combined with the lack of harbors isolated the Egyptian civilization from other growing civilizations in the Middle East and Mediterranean. The results of this isolation were twofold. One is that Egypt was very stable. It was easily united from within because of the Nile, but it was not easy to interfere with Egypt because it was protected in these ways. Either by land or by sea, Egypt was inaccessible, and thus they were safe from outside invasion, at least for a while. Another thing that it does is it allows Egypt to develop a unique culture, and we'll see as we go on how different Egyptian culture is from Mesopotamian culture. So the earliest things we know about Egypt are that around 5500 BC, early farmers appear. And these guys carried crops from Mesopotamia, so wheat, cows, sheep, peas, to Egypt and started raising those crops and animals on the Nile. Around 4000 BC, we begin to see evidence of basic civilization. And so people are organizing and using irrigated agriculture to grow their crops. And they're beginning also to fashion simple copper tools, which is the first step towards bronze metalworking. Finally, we see the emergence of two competing kingdoms. There's Lower Egypt, which is actually the one further downstream, so it's in the north and it looks like it's up to us, but Lower Egypt is in the north. And Upper Egypt, which is upstream and therefore further uphill, is in the south. The beginning of Egypt as a great civilization is usually dated around 3100 BC, when this leader, Menes, manages to unite the upper and lower kingdoms of Egypt. He declares himself the first pharaoh and begins a period known as the Old Kingdom. So the pharaoh rules as a god over Egypt. He is considered to be a deity. And of course, the pharaoh lives and dies like normal, but the Egyptians considered whoever managed to become pharaoh was given divine powers while he was in office, so to speak. And so this is another instance of theocracy, like we already talked about in Mesopotamia. But so the pharaoh, even though he rules as a god, rules in the name of this thing called Ma'at. And Ma'at is interesting. It's kind of like the Force from Star Wars. The Egyptians considered it to be the fundamental power that governed the universe. It's an impersonal and eternal spiritual force. And they believed that this spiritual force was a force for good that brought about order, harmony, and justice. And so the pharaoh's job was to institute Ma'at on earth. He would channel this eternal spiritual force through him and ensure that order and harmony and justice ruled on the earth. That was his reason for ruling. The most important achievement of the pharaohs in the Old Kingdom was the remarkable degree of centralization that they were able to bring about. And centralization is something that happens when a ruler or ruling group manages to bring about a high degree of control over their ruled territory. A single person can exercise their power over everybody else within the kingdom. And this happens in the Old Kingdom. The pharaoh owns all the land and directs all of the activity of everybody underneath him. He does this by setting up a governmental bureaucracy, which is a hierarchical structure for ensuring that certain things get done. And there's a picture of it over there. And so the pharaoh's at the top, and he takes care of certain religious duties and leads the Egyptians in war. But underneath the pharaoh, there is a prime minister, so to speak. The head of the Egyptian government is a vizier, and they carry out the will of the pharaoh and oversee the running of the day-to-day Egyptian government. And so below the vizier, there are these guys called nomarchs, and the nomarchs rule smaller sections of Egypt. So one person would control one chunk of the Nile, somebody else would do the other, and they would all answer to the vizier and receive their orders from the vizier. And then the nomarchs, in turn, would give orders to the leaders of every single Egyptian village. So in this way, the commands of the pharaoh would filter down until every village was doing what the pharaoh directed. And so the role of the government was basically implementing the will of the pharaoh. And this happened in the economic realm, where the pharaoh directed farming. He decided what would be grown, what would be mined, what would be built, and how trade would be carried out. The pharaoh and the government decided all of these things. The government also taxed the population and conscripted and led wars, and finally carried out important religious duties. The common people of Egypt believed that the pharaoh was responsible for causing the Nile to flood and therefore for keeping this whole cycle of agriculture going. So it's almost like a trade. The people of Egypt allow the pharaoh to have his power, but only because the pharaoh in return enforces the flooding of the Nile and the general rule of harmony and order on earth. That is Ma'at. The Old Kingdom begins to decline with a gradual rise of decentralization, and this is the opposite of centralization. As time goes on, the nomarchs begin to claim independent power. That is, they stop listening to what the pharaoh and the vizier tell them to do. Also, for a certain number of years, the Nile fails to flood for reasons that we don't understand. This undermines the pharaoh's authority because the Egyptians believed that the pharaoh was the one who caused the Nile to flood. So if he can't cause the flood to happen, that means that he doesn't deserve to rule over Egypt. This leads to a long period of civil war and anarchy, sometimes known as the Intermediate Period. But basically, Egyptian society breaks down and things are pretty terrible for a while. But around 2050 BC, strong rulers reappear and they bring about centralized rule once again and found the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom was a fairly peaceful time, not too much war going on or anything like that. It's known as the Golden Age of literature, and all sorts of poems and stories were composed during this time, and they were composed in the unique Egyptian script known as hieroglyphics, which you can see there. Hieroglyphics are the main reason that we know everything that we do know about the Egyptians, because we figured out how to read them about 150 years ago. Another thing that happens in the Middle Kingdom is Egypt begins to have some contact with other civilizations, using both trade routes through the deserts and some sea routes. The Egyptians begin to contact the Middle East and trade and stuff like that. But it's not long after these first contacts are made that the Egyptians are invaded by people from the Near East. This mysterious group of people known as the Hyksos ride down in horse-drawn chariots and defeat the Egyptian armies and conquer Egypt. And for 100 years, Egypt is ruled by these foreign invaders. The Hyksos rule in Egypt for about 100 years, but after that time, an Egyptian army rises up and drives the Hyksos out. And a new Egyptian pharaoh is installed, and the new kingdom begins, which lasts for about 400 years. The new kingdom is characterized by a number of powerful rulers, the most interesting of which are Hatshepsut and Ramses II. And under these rulers, Egypt begins to expand its power outward, whereas in the Old and Middle Kingdom, Egypt had focused just on controlling the Nile and had always looked inward. Under the New Kingdom, Egyptians begin to look outward, perhaps because they had just been conquered by people from outside. Either way, under Hatshepsut, we see an expansion of foreign trade, both down into Africa and into the Middle East. And then later, under Ramses II, Egypt begins to claim an empire, expanding outward, conquering both Nubia in Africa and much of the Middle East, all the way up to the top of the Euphrates River. And so Egypt at this time period has become an empire. After Egypt reaches this imperial peak under Ramses II, it begins a slow process of decline, marked by gradual decentralization and increasing instability. There are both uprisings within Egypt, people are unhappy with the pharaoh's rule, and also attacks by nomadic groups from the desert and from the sea. As a result of this, Egypt is weakened, and in 900 BC, Egypt is conquered by Assyria and remains conquered by Assyria for hundreds of years. After that, Egypt is conquered by Persia, and then by Greece, and then by Rome. Egypt has failed to remain an independent civilization and is slowly absorbed into these other civilizations. And what we see is the gradual disappearance of an independent Egyptian culture as Egypt takes on the cultural aspects of these other empires that have absorbed it. And so that is pretty much the end of the Egyptian civilization. So here are your key terms. They'll be on your key terms list. Yeah, pay attention. We'll be discussing them tomorrow. That's all.